I have worked on dozens of homicides in my years as an investigator, but no matter how many bodies you see, no matter how much blood soaks into your memory, there are a few cases that carve themselves into your bones. Cases that stay with you long after the courtroom doors close and the evidence boxes are sealed and shelved. For me, the Knoxville murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom are one of those cases. Even now, when the world grows quiet at night, I still hear echoes from that investigation. I still see what we found inside that small decaying house on Chipman Street. I still remember the smell, and I still remember the silence that surrounded the city before the truth broke it open. The story begins on the night of January the 7th, 2007. Knoxville was cold that evening. Not the kind of cold that bites your skin, but the kind that hangs low, quiet and heavy, settling on the roofs and sidewalks like an unspoken warning. At around 7:30 p.m., two college students, 21-year-old Channon Christian and her boyfriend, 23-year-old Christopher Newsom, walked out of a friend's apartment complex. It was an ordinary night for them. They were young, bright, and in love. They were planning dinner. They were planning the week ahead. They were planning a life that would never arrive. When they reached Channon's Toyota 4Runner, something unimaginable happened. Somewhere between the parking lot pavement and the turning of an ignition key, darkness found them. There are moments in a criminal timeline where everything fractures, where ordinary life splits open and reveals the predator hiding beneath it. For Channon and Chris, that fracture opened the moment a group of strangers approached them. That moment ended their lives, and it began the case that would haunt me for the rest of mine. It wasn't until the next morning that their families realized something was terribly wrong. Channon's father tried calling her phone again and again. No answer. Her mother felt a chill in her stomach that wouldn't leave. Chris's family reported him missing first. They knew he wouldn't disappear voluntarily. He wasn't that kind of man. But missing persons reports rarely trigger alarms immediately. Adults vanish for many reasons. Sometimes it's nothing. But this time, every instinct screamed that it was something. By the afternoon of January 8th, officers located Chris's burned body near a railroad track in East Knoxville. When I arrived on scene, the air was thick with smoke and the bitter scent of something far worse. His body was barely recognizable. His hands were bound behind him. There was a bullet wound in his head, one in his neck and one in his back. And the way the body had been left, it was clear the killers wanted to erase something. Erase him. Erase their involvement. Erase the evidence. But fire doesn't hide everything. Fire tells its own truth. While we were processing the scene, something inside me tightened. I had the sinking feeling that this was only half the story. And I was right. We hadn't found Channon. Her SUV was discovered not far from where Chris's body lay. Inside, we found a few personal belongings, signs of a struggle, and the unmistakable sense that time was running out. We didn't know then that she had already endured more horror than anyone should ever experience. All we knew was that she was missing, and every hour mattered. We expanded the search radius, knocking on doors, questioning residents, speaking to anyone who had seen an unfamiliar face or vehicle the night before. Tips began to come in. A neighbor recalled seeing a man parking Channon's SUV. Another said they saw suspicious movement near a house on Chipman Street, a small weathered house that looked abandoned at first glance. It wasn't. That house would become the center of everything. When we entered the property on January 9th, the smell hit us first. A mix of decay rot and something chemical. Something wrong. Inside, signs of violence were everywhere. Clothing on the floor, stains on the mattress. A kitchen that looked used for everything except cooking. It was the kind of place where a person could vanish inside without anyone noticing. We searched room by room, our flashlights cutting through the dim interior. And in the corner of the kitchen, inside a large trash can sealed with bags, we found Channon. Her body was bound, wrapped, and left like garbage. Even seasoned investigators felt the shock deep in their chest. She had been alive for hours after Chris was murdered. She had suffered unspeakably, and she had died alone in that suffocating darkness. That moment changed the tone of the case entirely. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. This wasn't random street violence. This was something else, something crueler, something organized. You don't commit a crime like this without intention, without malice, without a willingness to cross every line of humanity. Inside the house, we uncovered vital forensic evidence, DNA samples, fingerprints, items belonging to the victims, their phones, their clothes, their final hours frozen in physical traces left behind by the perpetrators. On the mantel, on the floors, in the bathroom sink, we found the first threads that began to unravel the identities of the suspects. Within hours, we had our first name, Lamaricus Davidson, the man who lived in the Chipman Street house. He had recently been released from prison, violent history, gang affiliation, an unpredictable temper. People in the neighborhood said he was the kind of man who invited trouble like a magnet. But this kind of violence, even they couldn't have imagined it. Davidson fled the moment we moved in. That alone told us he was involved. But he wasn't alone. Evidence pointed to a group, and that made everything more difficult. Multiple suspects meant multiple stories, multiple lies, and multiple layers to peel back before reaching the truth. Over the next 48 hours, we identified 4 additional suspects: Letalvis, Cobbins, Davidson's half-brother, Eric Boyd, George Thomas, and Vanessa Coleman. Each of them had a role. Each of them made choices inside that house. And each of them would eventually face the weight of those choices in a courtroom. Episode 1 is the beginning of the unraveling. The night Knoxville went quiet. The moment 2 young people were taken from the world. The moment we stepped into a case defined not only by brutality, but by the haunting truth that evil can surface anywhere, even in the heart of a small American city. And this is where our documentary begins. With the night, everything changed. There are places that never leave you once you walk inside them. Rooms where the air feels wrong, where the walls seem to hold their breath, where every step you take feels like trespassing into something deeply human and deeply violated. The house on Chipman Street was one of those places. Even now, years later, I can still see the peeling paint on the walls, the broken blinds, the stained mattress in the living room. I can still feel the weight of what happened there pressing against my chest the way it did the first time I crossed that threshold. After we found Channon's body, the house transformed from a suspected location into the beating heart of the investigation. Every detective in the unit moved with a kind of grim focus. We didn't speak much. We didn't have to. We all knew what we were standing in. Evil leaves a residue, and in that house it was thick enough to taste. The kitchen was the first room I revisited. The trash can remained where we found it, though the forensic team had already removed the body hours earlier. Objects don't usually carry emotion, but that trash can felt different. It felt like a symbol of how these killers viewed human life. Disposable, replaceable, something to be crushed and discarded. It was a reminder that what we were dealing with wasn't just murder. It was dehumanization. The forensic technicians were busy everywhere. Cameras flashed. Evidence markers covered the floors. Cotton swabs dipped into stains. Bags filled with clothing bindings, duct tape, and items we knew would later tell the story that no living witness could. The house wasn't just a crime scene. It was a timeline, a map of terror, the last unwilling witness to the victim's suffering. I moved into the bedroom next. It was small, dark, and claustrophobic, as if the walls had shrunk inward over time. The mattress was on the floor, filthy torn in several places. Stains marked the fabric in ways I didn't want to imagine but had no choice except to acknowledge. You learn to read stains the way other people read handwriting. These stains told a story of violence repeated again and again. On the wall above the mattress there were marks, scratches, dents, pressure points. Someone had been held there. Someone had fought there. Someone had lost. One of the forensic analysts handed me a swab report. Early results showed the presence of DNA from multiple individuals. Some matched the victims. Some belonged to people we had already begun to identify. Others belonged to unknown profiles which later tied back to the remaining suspects. The house spoke, but it spoke in fragments. It was our job to assemble the fragments into truth. As we processed the evidence, the question that mattered most emerged. How long had the victims been alive inside that house? It was a question that twisted my stomach into knots. The medical examiner's preliminary findings told us something we didn't want to accept. Channon had been kept alive for many hours. She was assaulted, tortured, and left in a state that no human being should ever endure. Chris had been killed earlier, executed and burned along the tracks. But Channon remained inside that house, trapped with her captors, fighting for breath and for hope. Every minute she remained alive meant another minute of unimaginable terror. Her suffering turned the crime into something even darker. This wasn't impulsive violence. This was sustained, controlled, intentional, and that knowledge changed how we approached every suspect. While the forensic team continued to process the house, other officers tracked the suspects. Leads were breaking fast. Fear makes criminals sloppy, and Davidson's crew had scattered like rats from a burning ship. One was picked up at a bus station. Another was found hiding with friends. Cobbins was tracked down in Kentucky with his girlfriend Vanessa Coleman. Boyd was located through an acquaintance. Each arrest brought a different kind of energy into the case, but none matched the intensity of the moment we captured Davidson. He was found hiding in an abandoned house not far from where Channon's body had been discovered. When we entered the building, he didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just stared at us with an expression I've seen only a handful of times in my career. Not fear, not guilt, just emptiness. A hollow space where a conscience should have been. His stillness was the most unsettling part. He looked like a man who had already accepted his fate because he understood what he had done, and he understood what was coming. Back at the station, the interrogations began. With 5 suspects in custody, the real battle was untangling the truth from 5 different versions of it. Criminal groups fracture quickly under pressure, each member scrambling to paint themselves as less guilty than the others. Loyalty collapses fast when the death penalty is on the table. Cobbins talked first. Not because he felt remorse, but because he wanted to survive. He denied harming Channon, tried shifting blame onto Davidson, claiming he was scared, claiming he had no choice. But his DNA in the bedroom, on the bindings, and on Channon's clothes contradicted everything he said. Fear doesn't explain participation. Fear doesn't excuse cruelty. Fear doesn't create DNA. George Thomas was calmer, quieter, harder to read. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with surgical caution. He painted himself as a bystander who was present but uninvolved. But the evidence didn't care about hesitation. His DNA was in that house. His presence was not passive. A man does not stay through 2 days of torture and murder by accident. A man who could walk out and call for help but chooses not to is as guilty as the one holding the weapon. Vanessa Coleman was the most complicated, young, impressionable, swept into a world she didn't fully understand. But the notebook we seized from her told us everything. She described the crime not with horror, but with fascination. Adventure, she had called it. The word made my blood run cold. Adventure was the last thing Channon and Chris experienced. Coleman wasn't innocent. She wasn't ignorant. She was complicit. Boyd was defiant. He had a long history of street connections, and he denied involvement in everything except helping Davidson hide afterward. But witnesses placed him near the SUV. His fingerprints were found in locations he couldn't explain. And though the physical evidence was thinner on him than on the others, the timeline didn't lie. He was involved whether he admitted it or not. But Davidson was the center of the storm. When it was his turn, he said nothing. No excuses, no explanations, no remorse. He leaned back in his chair, stared at the wall, and let silence speak for him. Some killers confess out of guilt. Others deny out of fear. Davidson did neither. His silence wasn't avoidance. It was a statement, a declaration, a reminder that he didn't see Channon and Chris as people. He saw them as objects, as targets, as opportunities for violence. The interrogations lasted for days, but every hour brought us closer to understanding the truth. And the truth was worse than anyone imagined. The timeline revealed that Channon and Chris were abducted randomly, but the violence that followed wasn't random at all. Once inside the house, the group made decisions, deliberate ones. Decisions to torture, decisions to assault, decisions to kill. It was planned in the moment, but still planned. The brutality wasn't born from panic. It was born from choice. As each piece fell into place, the image of what happened inside the Chipman Street house became clearer. That clarity came with a burden. Once you see the truth in a case like this, you can't unsee it. You carry it with you. You see it when you drive past that neighborhood. You think about it when you hold evidence in your hands. You feel it when you look at the victims' families in court, watching them break as they hear what happened in the final hours of their children's lives. Kerry Christian Channon's father was one of the strongest men I have ever met. But strength means nothing when facing the loss of a child. When I explained to him the early findings from the autopsy, his expression didn't change immediately. It took a moment. Pain often moves slowly like a shadow creeping across the floor. When it reached his eyes, I felt something in me break too. Chris's parents were quieter. Their grief settled inward, their shoulders curved forward as though the world had become heavier. They didn't ask for details at first. They didn't want to imagine what their son endured. They just wanted justice. Every family says that, but in this case it carried a different weight. Justice wasn't just a hope. It was a necessity, a moral demand carved into stone. By the middle of January, the evidence was overwhelming. We had DNA. We had fingerprints. We had confessions and contradictions. We had timelines that matched every movement inside the house. But more importantly, we had the truth, and the truth would follow each suspect into the courtroom. Episode 2 ends with the suspects captured, the evidence secured, and the stage set for a trial that would expose the darkest corners of this crime. But in many ways, this was only the beginning. Trials reveal more than guilt. They reveal the psychology of everyone involved. And in this case, the courtroom would become a battlefield. And as I would soon learn, the case was far from over. Evil has a way of echoing even after the suspects are behind bars. When you investigate a case as brutal as this one, there comes a moment when you realize you're no longer just following evidence. You're descending into the psychology of the crime, peeling away layers of human darkness until you stand face to face with what people are capable of when conscience no longer exists. By the time we entered the third phase of this investigation, that was where we found ourselves not simply reconstructing events, but dissecting evil itself. The suspects were in custody. The evidence was organized into boxes stacked taller than some of the younger detectives, and the autopsy reports were complete. Yet the most important part of the case was just beginning. We needed to understand why. Courts judge actions, but investigators must understand motives, choices, and the moments when those choices deviate from humanity. Without understanding the why, justice feels incomplete. The days following the arrests were spent in quiet rooms filled with transcripts, recordings, photographs, and notes. We replayed audio from interrogations over and over, listening for inconsistencies, emotional cracks, or moments of truth. Every voice told a different version of the same sequence of events, and each version concealed as much as it revealed. One afternoon, as I sat with a cup of cooling coffee and transcripts spread across my desk like a battlefield map, I began to form a clearer profile of the group dynamic. In crimes involving multiple offenders, hierarchy matters. Someone leads, someone follows, and someone enables. This case was no exception. Everything pointed to one gravity center: Lamarcus Davidson. Davidson had a long history of violence that did not erupt suddenly on the night of January 7th. It had been building for years. His arrests, his prison record, his history of intimidation and aggression. Some criminals commit violence because of desperation, but Davidson's violence came from dominance, control, a need to assert power. He cultivated an aura that pulled others into his orbit, especially those weak enough to be influenced, but strong enough to participate. Cobbins, his half-brother, was next in the hierarchy. Not as violent, not as dominant, but not innocent. His behavior suggested someone who feared Davidson yet also admired him in a distorted way. A man who lacked his own moral compass and borrowed Davidson's instead. The evidence placed him intimately in the room where Channon suffered, and no amount of fear could excuse the choices he made inside that house. George Thomas was harder to categorize. Unlike Cobbins, he did not appear motivated by fear or loyalty, but by apathy, a kind of chilling detachment. He stayed because staying was easier than leaving. He participated because the moment demanded it. He did not show remorse, only inconvenience at being caught. People like Thomas are reminders that evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply doesn't care. And then there was Vanessa Coleman. Young, naive, but those qualities did not absolve her. In her journal, she wrote about the events as if they were happening in a movie she was watching rather than real life unfolding around her. Her detachment was perhaps the most disturbing of all. She didn't intervene. She didn't stop anything. She watched. She absorbed the violence and transformed it into an experience. Her words revealed a dangerous lack of empathy, the kind that allows cruelty to grow unchecked. Eric Boyd occupied a strange position. His involvement was more peripheral, yet still significant. He helped Davidson hide, knew more than he admitted, and presence placed him close enough to the crime to bear responsibility. Some criminals are architects, others are accomplices, but accomplices still hold the ladder for the one climbing. These psychological distinctions mattered because they helped us reconstruct the sequence of decisions that led to the murders. The crime may have started with a carjacking, but what followed was not random chaos. It was a group feeding off the darkest impulses of one man, with each participant contributing to the brutality in their own way. While we analyzed these profiles, the autopsy reports added another layer of truth. Chris's injuries were consistent with bindings made from shoelaces and cords found in the Chipman Street house. He suffered blunt force trauma before being executed by multiple gunshots. The burns on his body were post-mortem inflicted to hide the evidence. These details did not just describe how he died. They described how he was treated, the indifference, the objectification, the total disregard for his humanity. Channon's examination was even harder to read. She endured prolonged suffering, both physical and psychological, before her death. Multiple assaults, injuries to her mouth, her limbs, her torso, evidence of being bound and gagged for long periods. Chemical burns, suggesting she had been washed or scrubbed, likely in a misguided attempt to remove DNA. Her final moments were not merciful. They were suffocating, isolated, and terrifying. The trash can was her last environment, and that fact alone haunted everyone involved in the investigation. As investigators, we live in the world of facts, but sometimes the facts cut too deeply to ignore. Channon and Chris weren't just names on a report. They were real. They were young. They had plans. They had families who loved them, and they suffered in ways that challenged the limits of human imagination. That reality fueled us. It sharpened our resolve. This case was not one we were willing to lose. The next stage of the process was the prosecution's preparation. District Attorney's Office brought us into strategy meetings where we discussed the narrative the evidence formed. A criminal trial is not just a presentation of facts. It is a story built from truth. A good prosecutor tells that story in a way the jury understands not just what happened, but why it matters. Our role was to ensure no piece of the truth was missing. The media attention intensified as we approached the preliminary hearings. Reporters filled the courthouse steps daily, their voices echoing through the corridors like a secondary soundtrack to the legal process. The brutality of the crime shocked the entire country. People searched for explanations, for meaning, for justice. Some discussions turned political, others turned racial. Controversies grew louder with each passing day, but inside the investigation room, none of that mattered. Our only focus was truth. Truth for Channon. Truth for Chris. Truth for their families. When the suspects appeared in court for the first time, I watched them closely. Davidson walked with the cold confidence of a man who had long embraced violence as a way of life. Cobbins looked nervous yet defiant. Thomas seemed indifferent. Coleman appeared overwhelmed, her eyes darting around the courtroom as if hunting for sympathy. Boyd maintained a posture of denial, stiff and guarded. The families of the victims were present in the gallery. Their grief filled the room more powerfully than any legal argument ever could. Even the judge paused before beginning the session, as though acknowledging the atmosphere of tragedy hanging above us all. Davidson's attorneys attempted to paint him as a man caught in a spiraling environment, a victim of circumstance. But the evidence contradicted every attempt to soften his role. Cobbins's defense relied on fear. Thomas relied on emotional distance. Coleman relied on youth. Boyd relied on technicalities, but the truth was impenetrable. The evidence tied each of them to the crime scene, to the victims, to the timeline. Still, the case encountered an unexpected complication when the presiding judge was found guilty of drug-related misconduct. His impairment affected not only this trial, but several others. It forced parts of the case to be retried, adding emotional strain to families already shattered by loss. I remember the day we received the news. Every investigator felt a flash of anger, not because we feared losing the case, but because the families deserved closure, not delays born from judicial failures. Through it all, the truth remained unchanged. Channon and Chris had been taken from this world in the most brutal way imaginable. The killers had acted with intention, cruelty, and a complete disregard for life. Now the justice system had to answer the question that had haunted us since the beginning. What punishment matches a crime like this? As the prosecution prepared for trial, I spent long nights reviewing transcripts, ensuring every detail aligned perfectly. I found myself thinking about the house again. That room, that trash can, the silence that lingered inside the walls. Crime scenes fade from memory over time, but some details return when you least expect them. The chipped paint on the windowsill, the smell of chemical cleaner, the indentation on the mattress, they replayed like fragments of a nightmare. But nightmares are made of truth, and the truth was almost ready to face the courtroom. Episode 3 closes with the anatomy of the crime fully revealed. The suspects defined, the motives understood, the evidence consolidated into a narrative sharp enough to cut through any defense. The next phase would be the trial, a stage where every detail would be dissected publicly, where the families would hear what no parent should ever hear, and where the defendants would face accountability. I knew the trial would not heal the wounds left behind. Nothing could, but justice can be a kind of light, and for this case it was the only light left. The courtroom was waiting, and we were ready. There is a moment in every major investigation when the silence of the evidence room is replaced by the noise of the courtroom. After months of studying blood patterns, DNA charts, autopsy reports, and interrogation transcripts, the case leaves the hands of investigators and enters the stage where truth must be spoken aloud, dissected publicly, and judged openly. For the Knoxville murders, that transition felt like walking from a morgue into a hurricane. Everything intensified, everything became heavier, everything sharpened. The families had waited long enough, we all had. And as we approached the first trial, I found myself thinking constantly about how justice works. It is slow, deliberate, careful, but in cases like this it must also be merciless. The brutality inflicted on Channon and Chris demanded accountability that matched the depth of the crime. No plea, no compromise, no version of mercy for those who gave none. The courtroom filled early on the first day. Reporters stacked along the back walls, sketch artists flipping pages, family members clutching tissues, hands shaking in their laps. The defendants entered one by one, each escorted by guards. Davidson walked with the same unsettling stillness he had during interrogation. Cobbins scanned the room like a man searching for sympathy he knew he didn't deserve. Thomas remained blank, almost bored. Coleman looked small in her oversized jumpsuit, her face tight with panic. Boyd maintained a stiff posture, jaw locked in defiance. I took my seat along the side wall, the row reserved for investigators. It is the position where you see everything, not just the legal proceedings, but the human reactions, the way jurors lean forward, the way parents close their eyes at certain words, the way defendants shift when evidence strikes too close. It is a theater of truth, and every seat tells a different story. The prosecutor began with a simple sentence that anchored the entire trial. "This case is about choice." He let the words settle. No theatrics, no raised voice, just truth. These defendants chose to abduct, chose to torture, chose to violate, chose to kill. They chose every step of the cruelty that unfolded inside the Chipman Street house. And choices have consequences. As the prosecution unfolded the timeline, the photographs we had lived with for months were shown to the jury for the first time. Crime scenes never lose their impact, no matter how many times you study them. The mattress, the bindings, the stains, the trash can. Each image pulled a quiet ripple of horror through the room. The mothers of both victims cried silently. Fathers stared straight ahead, their faces frozen as though any movement might cause them to break. I watched the defendants closely. Davidson stared without blinking, his expression unreadable. Cobbins lowered his head when the bedroom photos were shown. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Coleman cried, though I couldn't tell if it was guilt or fear. Boyd clenched his jaw harder, holding on to the illusion that his involvement was smaller than the others. Then came the forensic testimony. It was clinical, scientific, and devastating. DNA placed Davidson, Cobbins, and Thomas directly with Channon inside the bedroom. Fibers from the house matched the cords used to bind Chris. Chemical traces confirmed attempts to scrub Channon's body. Gunshot trajectory aligned with the railroad scene. It wasn't a puzzle anymore, it was a completed picture. The medical examiner delivered the hardest truth of the trial. His voice was steady, but the content was unbearable. He spoke of the injuries Chris suffered before he died. He explained the sequence of trauma inflicted on Channon. At one point, he paused. Even seasoned professionals need a moment when describing something inhuman. The jurors were visibly shaken. Several wiped tears away. One man closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, as though absorbing the information required physical effort. This was no ordinary murder case. This was something that demanded they confront the darkest parts of human capability. When it was the defense's turn, their strategy became clear. They tried to fragment the narrative, isolate responsibility, portray each client as less guilty than the others. Davidson's lawyers argued that he didn't act alone, subtly implying shared blame. Cobbins's team tried to paint him as fearful and influenced. Thomas's attorneys leaned on emotional detachment, claiming lack of direct participation. Coleman's defense leaned on youth and naivety. Boyd's attorneys insisted he only assisted after the fact, but the evidence tied them together like threads in a rope. Each defense fractured under the weight of physical truth. Every time they attempted to separate one defendant from the group, the timeline pulled them back together. The most emotional testimony came from the families. Channon's parents spoke of her warmth, her kindness, her dreams. Chris's family described his laughter, his work ethic, the life he should have lived. Their voices cracked, but they never broke. They spoke for their children because their children could no longer speak for themselves. Their presence alone anchored the humanity in the case. During one recess, I stepped outside to clear my head. Trials are clinical by design, but the emotional toll builds quietly. The hallway was filled with reporters whispering into their microphones. They wanted angles, headlines, reactions. I understood their job, but in that moment I wished for silence. I thought of the house again, the stillness of it, the tragic calm that hides horror. As the weeks unfolded, the trials progressed with unshakable momentum. Verdicts came one by one. Davidson was convicted on every charge, including first-degree murder, torture, rape, kidnapping. The jury recommended death. He showed no reaction, no flicker of remorse, no acknowledgement of humanity, just the same hollow stare. Cobbins received life without parole. Thomas received multiple life sentences. Coleman was convicted of facilitation, receiving decades behind bars. Boyd faced penalties in both federal and state courts. Each verdict carried a weight that filled the room. Justice is never victory. It is only accountability. But accountability matters. Yet something happened next that none of us expected. The judge overseeing the trials was found to have been under the influence of drugs during portions of the proceedings. His impairment tainted the legal integrity of several trials, including this one. The news hit like a blow to the chest. It meant retrials. It meant reliving the details. It meant dragging the families back into the storm they had fought so hard to survive. I remember the moment the district attorney informed us. The room fell silent. Investigators clenched fists. Prosecutors swore under their breath. No one blamed the law. They blamed the judge, whose weakness became another wound in a case already drenched in suffering. And yet we moved forward. Retrials were held. Evidence remained strong. Juries reached the same conclusions. Justice reaffirmed itself even after the system faltered. The truth does not weaken because someone fails. It stands whether supported or not. By the end of the retrials, years had passed. The families had aged. Investigators had grayed. The public had shifted focus to other tragedies. But for those of us who lived inside this case, time did not dilute its impact. I still remember the faces of the jurors as they delivered their decisions. I still remember the trembling in the voices of the victims' parents. I still remember the chill that ran down my spine every time the trash can photo was shown. The law had spoken. Accountability had been delivered, but trials do not close wounds. They simply acknowledge them. Episode 4 ends not with triumph, but with solemn clarity. Justice was served, but the loss remained. The courtroom echoed with the truth, but echoes eventually fade. What does not fade is the responsibility to remember what happened to honor Channon and Chris, by never allowing their story to be reduced to headlines or statistics. In the next and final episode, we step away from the courtroom and into the long shadow left behind. Evil does not disappear when verdicts are read. It lingers in the memories of those who witnessed it and in the lives forever changed by it. And as I learned in the years after, the aftermath of this case was as complex as the investigation itself. There is a belief that once the verdict is read, once the sentences are handed down, once the courtroom empties and the doors close, a case is over. But those who work in homicide know better. Cases do not end. They settle into the people who carried them, into the families who lost more than the world will ever understand, into the investigators who spent years piecing together fragments of the worst moments a person can endure. Justice may conclude in a legal sense, but the emotional truth keeps echoing long after the final gavel falls. The Knoxville murders were no exception. When the retrials ended and the last appeal was filed, the city exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. But beneath that release lived a shadow, the kind that doesn't disappear simply because justice has been served. Some cases linger. Some cases carve themselves so deeply into the culture and conscience of a community that they become part of its identity. And some cases, like the murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, become wounds that never fully heal. For me, the aftermath began on a quiet morning. The courthouse was nearly empty, and the halls that once vibrated with tension now sat in heavy silence. I walked alone through corridors where I had once seen reporters running families, crying, defendants in shackles, lawyers arguing. Now, the echo of my footsteps was the only sound. It felt strange to be there without urgency. Strange to realize that the official work, was done. But emotional work doesn't end with paperwork. The weight of a case like this lingers in ways you don't expect. I found myself thinking often about the house on Chipman Street, about how it had been condemned, torn down, replaced by an empty lot. People in the neighborhood wanted the land cleansed, cleared, erased, as if removing the structure could remove the memory. But memory doesn't obey demolition orders. I kept a piece of wood from that house, a splintered fragment of a door frame, not as a morbid souvenir, but as a reminder. Investigators learn early in their careers that forgetting is dangerous. Forgetting allows darkness to repeat itself. Remembering, though painful, keeps us vigilant, and this case demanded vigilance. In the months after the retrials, I met with the families several times, not because of legal necessity, but because people who endure tragedy like theirs deserve more than a handshake and a court ruling. They deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. Channon's parents spoke often about her optimism, her drive, her joy. Chris's family spoke about his strength, his humor, his future. They didn't dwell on how their children died. They focused on how they lived. It was their way of reclaiming something the killers tried to take. Even so, grief follows them like a second shadow. Some days are bearable. Some days are not. People assume time heals everything, but time only teaches people how to live around the wound. The wound itself remains. For the city of Knoxville, the emotional recovery was complicated. Some residents demanded harsher penalties. Others pushed back against racialized narratives the media had amplified or ignored. Conversations grew heated, political, fractured. A crime this brutal forces society to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about violence, but about perception bias and fear. What stayed with me most was how many people admitted they no longer felt safe. This case had broken something in them. The brutality was so extreme, the randomness so terrifying, that it challenged their belief in the world as they thought it was. And fear, once seeded, grows quickly. To me, the most important reminder that emerged from this case was that evil does not appear wearing warning signs. It doesn't arrive with dramatic music or a villain's entrance. It hides in plain sight, in neglected houses, in quiet streets, in people who seem ordinary, until the moment they reveal they are not. That is what makes evil dangerous. That is why vigilance matters. Years passed, but every January, families, investigators, students, and community members gathered for a memorial. Sometimes the crowd was large, sometimes small. Sometimes the weather was cold and harsh, sometimes calm. But people came. People remembered. They read the names Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom aloud. They lit candles. They prayed. They hugged one another. They stood together in defiance of what had happened. One year a woman approached me after the ceremony. She couldn't have been more than 25. She told me she wasn't from Knoxville, didn't know the victims personally, but had followed the case since she was a teenager. She said she came every year because remembering mattered. Because people deserved to be more than the violence done to them. Because she believed that honoring victims was a way of resisting the darkness. Her words stayed with me. They reminded me why I chose this work. Why any investigator chooses it. Not for the arrest, not for the trials, not for the headlines, but for the truth. For the preservation of memory. For making sure the stories of victims don't disappear beneath the weight of brutality. When the case officially closed for the final time, I placed the evidence files back into the archive room. Box after box labeled in black marker. Christian Newsom, homicide, 2007. As I slid the last file onto the shelf, I felt the same coldness I had felt when stepping into the Chipman Street house for the first time. A sense that something heavy had pressed itself into the air. Before turning out the lights, I looked back at the shelves. Hundreds of boxes stood there, each containing a story that ended too soon, but some boxes weigh more than others. This one weighed the most. The case had changed me. It had sharpened my understanding of cruelty. It had deepened my appreciation for resilience. It had forced me to confront the limits of justice and the endurance of grief. It taught me that justice is not a finish line. It is a responsibility, a continual act. And yet, despite everything, I also found hope in this case. Hope in the families who refused to let tragedy define the lives of their children. Hope in the community who gathered each year to remember. Hope in the investigators and prosecutors who never allowed the truth to be bent or diluted. Hope that even when faced with unimaginable darkness, people choose to stand together in the light. As I close this final episode, I return to a memory from the early days of the investigation. I was standing outside the Chipman Street house, the crime scene tape fluttering in the wind, the sun beginning to rise over Knoxville. And for a moment, the world was quiet. A fragile quiet. The kind that comes before the truth begins to speak. In that moment, I whispered a promise to the victims, to their families, to myself. A promise that no matter how long the investigation took, no matter how much darkness surfaced, no matter how deeply the case carved into those who carried it, the story would be told honestly, completely, without hesitation. This documentary series is the fulfillment of that promise. For Channon, for Chris, for truth, and for the light that must always follow the dark.